Hi, my name is Amy Nassar, and this is my presentation about protests. Okay, so my question is, are protests beneficial to society? And to analyze this, we're going to first see what are protests for. Through my research, I saw that protests usually are a call to reduce the suffering of a certain marginalized group in society. So to achieve this goal, protests have to do several things. First things first, they have to show and demonstrate their perspective. They do this by the actual protest, and through this demonstration, they make their opinions known and gain more coverage in the news, perhaps, in order to raise attention for their causes. You can see this especially in the historian article when he mentions the abolitionist movement, which was a protest against the enslavement of African Americans in the United States. In the article, he states that the way people think and feel is an organic part of history, which has to do with the idea of perspective in protests, because a protest results from a massive emotion in history. This is also seen in the civil rights movement, where people were trying to make known that they too were people and they were demanding equal rights. This is also seen today in gun rights protests, and protests generally show an idea of dissent and discontent with the way things currently are happening in society. So because of their ability to demonstrate an opinion on a certain topic, protests can also gain support with people who either identify with the cause or are allies for the cause and want to work towards the ending of suffering for a certain group. This is especially exemplified by the Women's March in January of 2017, which spread from the original march in Washington, D.C. to hundreds of sister march days around the country and around the world, for example, in Iran. Because of protests' ability to show their perspective in society and then gain solidarity and support, as they reach more coverage, they spark more and more discussion about how to solve a certain issue or about the issue in general. Here we can see that from after a shooting in Parkland, Florida, Marco Rubio is in a town hall discussing gun legislation with a parent. This is an example of how, because of the demonstrations against guns, discussions were sparked. So as perspectives are shown through discussions and solidarity is gained and discussions are sparked, change occurs, and this change is usually directed towards the original purpose of the protest, a call for reduced suffering. Pertaining to my example earlier of the abolitionist movement, the change was the Emancipation Proclamation, in which black slaves were freed under law now, which reduces their suffering as enslavement was ended. This is also seen, this change in order to produce reduced suffering of a marginalized group is also seen in the civil rights movement. After Black Americans suffered under Jim Crow, and many protests had demonstrated their perspective, and solidarity had been gained by allies, and discussions were sparked. Eventually change came, and the Civil Rights Act was passed. So in conclusion, protests, by promoting a certain perspective and promoting solidarity and gaining support and eventually sparking discussion, change is most likely the next step and concludes a protest's whole purpose. But in order to reduce the suffering of a certain group, which benefits society as tensions are released between marginalized groups and the groups doing the repression. But protests can also increase tensions, which brings us to our limitations, where many researchers have seen, such as NPR, that because protests can sometimes get overly violent, they tend to become more and more drastic and radical. And this turns people against these protests and can increase tensions, which can be seen in places such as Rwanda, too, after protests, which resulted in the Rwandan genocide. So protests with more drastic and radical methods and that use violence can often hurt society and lead to more and more discontent and more marginalization and negatively affect society overall. My website.
So, how did you use the conclusions and questions of others to advance your own research?
Could you repeat the question?
How did you use the conclusions and questions of others to advance your own research?
In some of the articles that I read, they concluded that protests were only successful if they were nonviolent. And so I looked and I saw the way nonviolent protests worked in order to become successful off of these conclusions. And then I also researched on how violent protests didn't work.
Okay. So how did you select the strategies you used to gather information, and were they effective?
I mostly looked at historical occurrences of protests, and I looked on articles that analyzed the psychology of protests, and I thought that these were effective because of an idea of like mob psychology really works out in protests and movements like this. So I thought analyzing the psychology and the history of protests would be the most effective way to understand them.
All right. Thank you.